Now, the idea came from the editor at Cambridge University Press, Michael Watson, who was asking me for quite some time. Can't remember how long or when it started, it felt like years. He was asking me to write a general survey of British history through the 20th century. And I kept resisting because it sounded such a daunting thing to do. But then I got to think, well, I've been teaching this for 40-odd years, and I've been teaching survey courses, mainly to MA students. And so, really, I should be able to do such a thing. And I felt there was a gap in the market, that there wasn't a really good, lucid, clear survey for my students. There's some very good, very perceptive books, but none that does, as you've described, integrates all these different essential aspects of history since 1900 and tries to convey it lucidly. So in the end I gave in and thought, yes, I'll do it. Then Michael suggested that it'd be good to have as a theme inequalities. Since I've written about inequalities in various ways, you've suggested gender inequality, age inequality, inequality between rich and poor, and obviously there are other important areas like race that needed to be talked about. So that seemed a good idea to give some coherence within this broad survey, so it wasn't just one fact after the other quite. Then the next question was, what do we call it? I mean, one obvious possibility was Unequal Britain, but I'd already used that for a book that I'd edited, so we couldn't do that. Then Michael again, who's been an excellent editor, suggested Divided Kingdom, since the official title of our country, as I say early in the book, is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but it's been disunited in all kinds of ways, and that's what I'm talking about. So inequalities were an appropriate theme because major inequalities became politically prominent around 1900, in the early 1900s, and have never gone away. The first major poverty surveys then revealed shocking inequalities of income and social conditions, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. The Labour Party was formed in 1900, primarily to combat conditions like that, and trade unions were increasingly active for the same reasons. The women's suffrage campaign challenged gender inequality, aiming for votes for women as a first step towards removing the many other inequalities, social as well as gender inequalities. And they were partially successful in gaining the vote in 1918. Racial antagonism towards Jewish refugees from persecution in Russia led to the first restrictions on immigration in Britain in 1905 and real race inequalities. So I try to trace the persistence of these inequalities, their rises and falls, and their impacts on people's lives. But in the end, what most surprised and shocked me from studying these themes were the very close similarities between the extent and the causes of poverty and income inequality in Britain around 1900 and now. Then, well-known surveys by Charles Booth and Seaborn Rowntree found about 25 to 30% of the British population to be living in poverty. In over 50% of cases, The main reason was not the feckless idleness of the poor, as some people preferred to think, but the main reason was low pay for full-time work. People who worked hard, tried to work hard, but also often had difficulty finding regular work. In the past few years, up to now, an array of experts, NGOs, think tanks concerned with poverty issues, using far more sophisticated survey techniques than Booth and Rowntree, find around 25% of the UK population are living in poverty, about 30% of children, and 50 to 60% of these people are in households which include a worker who's too low paid to support the family, despite his or her best efforts. So the similarities, they really did shock me, and they are shocking and horrifying. This suggests that absolute poverty, comparable with 1900, really hasn't gone away. And in the 1900s, the shock of these revelations led to the first measures of what became the welfare state. Between 1906 and 1911, we saw the introduction of free school meals for poor children, state old age pensions, national health and unemployment insurance, and the regulation of the most insecure work and pay. Later, council housing was built to improve housing conditions. And I describe how conditions then gradually improved, especially after 1945, when the welfare state really expanded. Poverty and inequality in Britain reached their narrowest point, and welfare benefits and services were at their most generous in the late 1960s and 1970s. The 1970s is much maligned in Britain by right-wingers as a terrible time when the trade unions ruled the country and life was paralysed by strikes. But for very many people, it was a very good time, the best time. Then from the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher's Conservative premiership, unemployment and poverty soared, welfare was cut, workplaces were deregulated, and affordable housing sold off, and the supply dwindled. There was a temporary respite under the Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown from 1997 to 2010, or at least until the financial crisis from 2008. But then under Conservative-led governments since 2010, poverty's increased still further. So the fact that the state once managed to reduce these inequalities through welfare measures and improvements to the labour market, but that they've returned due to state cuts to welfare in an unregulated labour market, this should hold a message for policymakers. The British state once improved social conditions, and it could do so again. And I was particularly struck by the return of poverty because I spent so much of my career working on the history of the welfare state. And poverty is regularly in the news in Britain. But I've also been very conscious of another story much in the news in Britain recently. At the beginning of the book, I try to explore the composition and culture of the United Kingdom in the 1900s. And I ask, among other things, who was recognised as British at that time. And when I read this a year or so ago, I thought I was one of very few people who knew that in 1900 and until the 1960s, anyone born anywhere in the vast British Empire was officially British. That is, millions of people, with all the rights of anyone born in the United Kingdom, including the right to reside there. Then the so-called Windrush crisis erupted this year when it was discovered that many people who migrated to Britain from colonies and former colonies in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, when they were British citizens, were being excluded or expelled from the country or refused citizen rights, such as the right to health care. It's called the Windrush Crisis because a boat called HMS Windrush landed in Southampton in 1948, carrying the first very large number, more than 400, of immigrants from the West Indies. They were coming because they'd been encouraged by the government to come to fill the acute labour shortage we had after the war. And many of the people who'd been suffering from recent exclusions were children who came with their parents in the late 40s, 50s, early 60s. But the fact that these people were British, had British rights, seems to have been forgotten by everyone except the victims, and their rights became increasingly restricted from 1962 as the economy didn't need them quite so badly, it wasn't doing so well. There was less demand for them and increased racist antagonism. Through the whole period since 1900, poverty and social inequality got better and then worse. But the treatment of immigrants became steadily more hostile and restrictive from the 1960s on, particularly, as their numbers and their countries of origin have expanded. Though it also has to be said, and I try to trace this in the book, there have always been strong movements of anti-racism, opposing extremes of hostility. They've never gone away, and they have at times brought about legislative attempts to reduce racial discrimination, particularly under the Labour government of the 1960s. These are just some of the themes I discuss in the book. I say quite a lot, of course, about gender inequality, where I think the story, in contrast to the other themes, is one of very slow, very incomplete, but real improvement over time.
What I take from the United Kingdom is a very productive emphasis on the multiple and diverse trajectories which have shaped modern Britain. I eventually entered the political world of gay liberation in the 1970s by coming out, one of the forms of identity politics, as it later became to be called, which defined the new social movement. And as Pat says in the book, the term gay became international. The gay movement also experienced divisions. Lesbians felt their interests were ignored. Transgender people felt excluded, as did some ethnic minorities. The political idea of gay liberation privileged an educated white male activist who was more often than not shaped by a distinctive American or North European moral legacy, as it had been exported worldwide by religion, rationality and empire. The point I'm making out here is that the sexual politics of the 1960s and 70s look even more complicated when they're told through the prism of family and personal history. Others, of course, can tell their own equally complex stories, because it mattered a lot where you were in Britain in the mix of gender, affluence and education, in terms of what your access to sexual knowledge, for example, was like. In Derbyshire, I got absolutely no sex education, neither from my parents, nor from the boys' grammar school, where I was a student. And for me as an adolescent, the press and TV were crucial for getting sexual knowledge. Equally, many of the things associated with Victorian sexuality, regimes of silence, codes of obedience, authoritarian fathers, evangelical religion, were alive and kicking in the 60s in families like mine. I use that point with students to show how an active 19th century moral legacy jostled for space inside the heads and the bodies of many 1960s contemporary subjects in that period.
The book raised for me the knotty problem of how we as historians apply, construct or question the categories that we use when we analyse our subjects. I would love to hear more from Pat about the challenges posed by examining both legislative change and individuals' experiences, an excellent ambition that is set out in her introduction and followed through in each section. For example, on class, Pat makes the point, drawing on Mike Savage's work, that class identities remain very strong into the 21st century. Indeed, a majority of British people still identify as being working class. But at another point, she makes the equally salient point that by the 1980s, in occupational terms, more and more people were middle class. And occupation is very often used as a proxy for class through the book. A related point could be made about feminism, which appears as a force for change throughout. When do we as historians categorise women and activists as feminists? I think Pat offers a very sensitive approach in this regard, as in many others. She is meticulous in analysing what her sources can offer and generous in giving readers the information that they need in order to evaluate those sources. Her examination of whether we can know how women voted in elections is a case in point. But given that this is not the kind of book to talk extensively about methodology, I'd love to hear her thoughts now on how she determined when and how to use categories like class and feminism, how far identity, experience, or how other people saw people played into this, since it speaks to the relationship and sometimes tensions between how someone sees themselves, how politicians treat them, and how scholars define them. I think that this is not only relevant in terms of the context of class, but also in relation to sex and gender. The book's own vocabulary traces a shift in concern, both scholarly and political, from sex to gender in debates around equality. But one reason why some of us as feminists critique the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, presented here as a milestone in the fight for equality, because it allowed trans people to identify as the gender they chose, and while we oppose current measures to make self-identification both easier and more widely used by the state, is that counting gender alone can potentially erase women from some of the very important statistical surveys and classifications that are used within this work. This year, for example, it's already proving more difficult to know how many women have gone into higher education in the UK because the data thus far has counted students on the basis of gender rather than sex, and we know that up to 1,000 students have classified themselves as non-binary. It isn't clear to what extent people's gender and sex is aligned anymore, or indeed how we're going to find that out in future. The book's central focus on inequality and equality is not only timely, but highly thought-provoking. I wondered if equality was an objective or a key word of those groups that Pat identifies as being agents of progressive change over the past century, feminists among them. Was equality a rallying cry? Or is it more the case that it makes a highly convincing retrospective analysis of the political and social struggles and developments of the last century? And I guess I'm thinking here in particular about how activists and groups see their own histories. Do they connect themselves to groups in the past that they see as fighting for equality the same as they do? And also whether equality is or ever has been a key word which has meant a great deal to certain sections of the electorate. I'd also love to know more from Pat, although she did touch on this in her opening remarks, about her views of current understandings of inequality and what we do with those. I was recently part of a discussion with shadow ministers connected to the UK Labour Party, alongside representatives from think tanks and NGOs about this. A point made by a representative of a very prominent and influential social research and charitable foundation in the UK was that they felt that Labour and its outriders, as they called me, basically, overplay the level of inequality, but also the impact of inequality on most people's lives. And that, quote, we aren't paying enough attention to the fact that most people feel reasonably okay. I wonder if Pat thinks that the current political or scholarly representation of the economic circumstances of Britain is lacking in any way, given her admirable research, not only for this book, but across her career. And what she thinks about the current sociological stress on the differences between the top or elite, richest 1%, or in some cases 10%, versus the rest. And finally, I would love to hear from everybody here, our audience, about whether they found the focus and narrative around inequality and equality as convincing a representation of the past century as I did. I think, as I said at the beginning, that we who work on 20th century history rarely focus on such big questions in scholarly gatherings, unlike our early modern colleagues in many cases. And the fact that Pat has provoked this debate is just one of the very valuable contributions of her book.
It's also a riposte to a very popular fiction in sort of media representations of Britain, which Frank has referred to in recent teleprograms and on radio programs, and some terribly respectable histories of Britain too. Never exhausted in British film and media, riposts to the fiction of a united kingdom, which is always elusive and always a chimera. So the idea of the fiction of the United Kingdom is very familiar to us in Britain, in the repetition of Winston Churchill's during the Second World War, evening BBC broadcasts listened to by every family and their neighbours, whoever owned a wireless, from August 1940. And best of all, of course, in the context of Pat's own argument, which I agree with Selina, I think is very strong throughout the book, in the hopes of those who read the 600,000 copies sold of William Beveridge's Plan for Social Insurance, published in 1942. And I think one of the interests of reading this book is what can governments do? There's an optimistic reading of British history, despite the shocks that every speaker has outlined of continuing poverty, of a racialised and divided Britain, of horrendous economic histories. There's nevertheless a determined mind at work synthesizing this material, tracing the continuities and changes, and insisting that people can come together to change things in voluntary associations, in political movements, but also governments can, through social policy and through attending to the movements of collective forces of the people that they govern. There's a concern, I would suggest, and I'd like to ask Pat more about this, for an ethical political economy which underpins her analysis. I am interested, in spite of reservations from other speakers, on what Pat might think about the possibilities of a renewed social the strengths on which a renewed social democracy might be built, because I think there's so much in this book that we can learn from, and which is quietly being said about, the powers that governments do have, the powers that ordinary citizens do have, whether in voluntary associations, in more familiar organisations like trades unions, but also in the emergence of political movements, anti-racist, feminist, whatever.
We live in times not only of a hoped revival of progressive social democracy, but also of social actors across the globe who are really saying, tear up that rule.
So I did think, actually, when I was working on it, but something that came through to me very strongly, but perhaps I don't emphasise enough in the book, is where in the Conservative Party there have always been strong forces against state action, state regulation of the state regulation of society, which have been stronger and weaker at various times, but have been very strong since the 1980s, but very strong since 2010, where the old sort of humane, noblesse oblige conservative tradition of caring about the poor and feeling it's the responsibility of the rich to help the poor, that seems to have vanished. Or if it has, it's not publicly obvious, not obvious in the government. I think equality, to some degree, was an objective of most activists. They didn't necessarily have an illusion of complete equality, but certainly narrowing the worst inequalities has been a strong objective of the labour movement in socio-economic terms. Feminists wanted gender equality, for women genuinely to have the same rights and opportunities as men. Gay activists really wanted to be treated like equal human beings and not as something inferior. How much it matters to most people, I suspect, unless they feel that they're a victim of inequality in some severe way, it maybe doesn't drop, but I think it's something we don't know very much about. How much concern people feel about the extent of poverty at the moment, I don't know. There certainly is surveys seem to show that people are more willing at present to pay higher taxes to improve services. But that may be because they want a better health service for themselves and not for others. I think it is an area in which people's attitudes are very much influenced by the popular press, where attacks on people who receive benefits as just being idle scroungers who'd rather lie in bed all day than go to work, despite the fact that most benefits are worth even less than the wages they could earn, and it's not a comfortable life. But that view is promoted by the right-wing press and does influence some people. The possibility of renewed social democracy, I feel moderately optimistic in Britain that enough people are now getting angry enough about the very poor treatment, for example, of people in many workplaces. And in fact, there were these strikes last week in places where there haven't previously been strikes, suggests quite a lot of change. And there are more younger people who are committed to Labour and impressed by Corbyn, for example. So I think there are possibilities, but I don't underestimate the capacity of the right to hit back, so we'll see. And then along came Margaret Thatcher and neoliberalism and cuts to the welfare state, which so many of them were reversed under New Labour, the Blair-Brown government from 1997 to 2010. But they couldn't change everything, though poverty did go down and unemployment. But since 2010, it's just got worse and worse, and now we're back in the situation of the 1900s. But whereas then it led to a welfare state, now it's a result of cuts to the welfare state. And that's what most shocked me, because obviously welfare is what I've worked on, so it's what but it's a shocking reality.